My name is Lauren McIntyre and I work for Heritage Burial Services at Oxford Archaeology. I was Osteologist and co-director of the Roman cemetery excavation at Brougham on the A66. Today I'm just going to be discussing a bit about the excavation itself and show you some of the things that we found. I need to point out that we haven't analysed any of these finds yet. Everything I'm discussing here is very preliminary. It could change when we get to the post-excavation analysis phase of the programme. The excavation of archaeological sites along the A66 is being undertaken as part of improvement of the A66 between Scotch Corner and the M6 bi-national highways. I'm not going to be talking about the road scheme itself today, but I've put in a QR code on the slide that you can follow if you want to know any more about the development itself. So basically, the vast majority of archaeological excavation that occurs in the UK is developer-led and funded by people who want to build in roads, building houses, shopping centres, all that kind of thing. It's a legal part of the planning process. So we have to excavate everything and record what we find prior to any groundworks, because otherwise the archaeology would just be destroyed. Unfortunately, it's not possible in our case to leave anything to be preserved in situ for people to see, because it'd just be destroyed by the roadworks. So everything has to be removed from the ground down to impact depth and fully recorded. So here you can see the western extent of the scheme marked in red on the bottom left of the image. A close-up of scheme 3A, you can see there, and the site itself is marked with a little star. The Roman cemetery is a scheduled monument, and it's actually located across the road from the settlement or vicus. There is also an associated fort about half a mile to the southwest of the cemetery. Today this presentation is going to focus just on the cemetery area. Unfortunately, I don't have time to cover the vicus as well, or at least not in any way that does it justice. The first part of the cemetery excavation was actually undertaken in 1966 and 1967, so we're not really the first people to be digging in there, although we're the first people to be digging in that specific area. So the 60s excavation was largely a rescue one, with part of the area in question excavated very, very quickly during a programme of roadworks aiming to straighten out the A66. So Roman tombstones were now from the area as well, so there was a good indication of what was to be found on site. The 66 excavation was directed by Dorothy Charlesworth for the Ministry of Public Buildings and Works. 12 trenches were excavated and contained about 45 cremation burials. A watching brief was supposed to be undertaken in the following year in May in advance of the roadworks. However, the road building programme started early, so archaeological works had to be undertaken very rapidly while the road itself was being built, and the archaeologists then managed to salvage around 100 burials as well as 30 non-burial features. There was another watching brief at the end of May 1967, followed by 3 weeks excavation in July that year. And although an attempt was made to undertake thorough excavation, there were a lot of time constraints and priority had to be given to obvious burial groups. A total of 168 cremation deposits were excavated then, and 14 non-burial features too. And at the time, this was the largest cemetery area ever to be excavated in the north of England. Unfortunately, though, post-excavation work was extremely slow. It was hindered by a lack of funding, and then Dorothy Charlesworth's death in 1984. New post-excavation reports were actually commissioned in the year 2000 because they never got finished. And then the monograph was actually published in 2004. And you can see the title of that monograph there, The Roman Cemetery at Brougham in Cumbria, and just a few images from that publication showing you a few things that they found. Some of these things we'll be revisiting slightly later in this talk. So overall, the data from the 1960s excavation gave us a very good basis for what to expect on our excavation. It suggested the cemetery was largely 3rd century in date and likely founded upon or shortly after the arrival of whichever military unit had established the nearby fort. It's unclear exactly which unit established the fort, although there was an inscription from an altar stone that was found close to the site in the 19th century that suggested that it may be the Numerus Equitum Stratonicionorum, or the Stratonicean cavalry. It's not clear exactly where this unit was from, but it's possible that the name comes from one of several small towns in the east of the Roman Empire, who are basically modern-day Turkey. The inscription you can see on the slide and also the translation. This is the only inscription pertaining to anyone and where they might have come from in the vicinity of the site, and the stone itself has now been lost, so the evidence is pretty tentative. And crucially, there's no evidence for the 1960s excavation of anything on the site that predates the Roman cemetery. Now we come on to our project. Obviously, there's an exploratory evaluation a couple of years prior to full excavation. I'm not going to be talking about that today. I'm going to focus on the excavation. We started in January 2025 with the first area stripped and ready for the team to excavate by early February. You can see from this photo it was extremely cold. There was a couple of days that I was up there where it was snowing a little bit and it was -5. So, I mean, Cumbria in February, so there you go. The very, very first areas, which you can see sort of beyond that pylon in the photograph, were almost devoid of archaeology. There was very little at all. The area that you can see on the slide is the first place that we began to find proper features, including a roughly north-west to southeast ditch that ran across the entire east end of the area. It really quickly became apparent that this was probably the cemetery boundary ditch. There were a few features to the immediate east, a few things that possibly look like inhumation graves, and then multiple burials to the west of the ditch and even cut into the ditch itself. So once the first area was completed, this was signed off and backfilled for logistical reasons like access and spoil storage and all that kind of thing. And then we began to strip the second area to the immediate west, so following on from where we'd left off. It was extremely slow to excavate the second area. We were only using a 5-ton machine, which you can see on the slide, for the stripping. And the reason for this was because in a lot of places, the archaeology and the burials were only about 20 centimetres below the topsoil. So we had to machine extremely slowly and carefully to try and avoid clipping or damaging anything archaeological. And you can see our supervisor Cami there on the slide being very careful, hand digging things where she thinks there might be features to highlight so that they don't get trashed by the machine. This second area had a lot more archaeology than anticipated. It's hard to express exactly what it was like on the site, so we've put together some footage of our field team at work to give you a bit of a flavour.
I have a little bit of a surprise here in this potential formation grave. By cleaning those little fragments of kist, maybe from a capping stone, this was just under. That is the top of a glass vessel, and it's fully intact rim. It's beautiful.
Okay, so we've uncovered 3 different vessels within this cremation cut. We think that this black burnishware one is the actual urn, and that the other 2 are grave accessories. So we've got the jug and a Samian dish as well, all within the one cut.
So I found the base of a dish, and it's got a potter's mark. So the potter's mark is of Marinus III, and that's the man who made this dish. And he's mainly working throughout like East Gaul during the late 2nd century to the early 3rd century.
So here you can see an overall plan of the site once we'd finished. You can see the first area that we excavated is approximately that eastern third on the right of the slide, and the second area is the rest of it on the left. You can see that boundary ditch that I mentioned running sort of northwest to southeast on the right side of the plan. You can also see that there are no boundary ditches to the north, south or east of the excavation area, so we're presuming the cemetery continues beyond the limit of excavation in these 3 directions. You can also see some hashed rectangles on the plan. Those are the evaluation trenches from the earlier excavation. It's apparent from this plan that the site is very busy archaeologically. We don't just have discrete burials, there's also multiple circular features and curvilinears. We think that these might have been small earthworks used to mark graves. Some had central burials, some had cremations dug into the ring ditches themselves, and again, I'm going to go into this a little bit more in just a second. We did have a surprise on the site that wasn't expected. I said that the 1960s excavation didn't find any evidence of any earlier activity on the site, so the cemetery must have been established by whoever built the fort. Well, these features that I've just highlighted kind of blew that idea out of the water, because the feature on the right is an inverted or upside down cordoned urn. Unfortunately, it's quite truncated, so we lost the upturned base. It's probably been ploughed, quite honestly. The exact date of the pottery is unclear at the moment because it's not been analysed, but preliminary suggestions by our pottery specialists are that it's mid to late Bronze Age. We've not actually excavated this urn yet, but we're expecting it to contain quite a lot of cremated bone. The pot was actually buried in what we think was either a tree throw or a very, very bioturbated pit. It's quite hard to tell because it was very close to modern ground level, and it was also affected by modern routing as well as the ploughing. The other image on the left shows an unurned cremation that's got burnt flint arrowheads in it. Now, it's in very close proximity to the cordon urn, you can see. And again, we think this is likely to be something like later Bronze Age in date, but again, we're waiting for specialists to look at the flints. We actually had a large pit cut in this feature containing the arrowheads, which had a lot of large cobbles and rocks in, and pockets of cremated bone throughout. It's interesting that these features are located on the highest part of the site. I know that we don't know exactly how much of the ground level has been lost or changed over time, but the location of these features here and their provisional date suggests that we're looking at a small mid to late Bronze Age barrow or cemetery, which pushes back the date of funerary activity on the site by several thousand years. Many of the features immediately around these were actually sterile or tree throws, so the Roman features generally do tend to respect this area. So it looks like we've got a small Bronze Age cemetery or monument that may have still been visible during the Roman period, so that when the Roman cemetery was established, it might have been a deliberate choice to focus this around the earlier Bronze Age activity. And it makes those ring gullies that you can see on the map even more intriguing. On the face of it, we do have Roman finds from some of the fills from the ring gullies and Roman cremations that appear to have been deliberately dug into the gullies, but we can't yet rule out the possibility that some of them, or even all of them, are a lot earlier, possibly containing other Bronze Age cremations and maybe being the remains of small prehistoric barrows. So one thing that we need to do during the analysis phase of work is investigate these to see whether we might have more prehistoric features than we previously thought, or if the ring gullies are indeed Roman like the rest of the things on site. So a good programme of radiocarbon dating I think is needed to sort this out. Now, getting back to the Roman cemetery. In terms of numbers on our site, we think we had around about 350 graves. The majority of these contain cremated remains, so 75 graves had earned cremations and the rest were unearned. These might have been put straight in a pit in the ground without a container, or in some cases they might have been in an organic container like a cloth bag that has since rotted and left no archaeological trace. About 75 graves contained ceramic vessels, some of which had cremated remains inside, others were devoid of bone, and so these were probably accessory vessels or grave goods. We had 47 cremation graves in stone kists. We also had several graves that were packed with cobbles and some that appeared to have been lined with wooden planks. And as well as this, we had 37 inhumation burials, 12 of which were in stone kists, and 1 pyre. And I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about these now. So, talking about the earned and unearned cremation burials, every context which contained cremated bone was sampled. That was an awful lot. We actually took 1,084 cremated bone samples from the site. I cannot tell you how many that tubs it was, but it was a lot. So it was a very familiar sight to see people excavating features surrounded by absolutely loads of white sample tubs, like you can see with Joe on the slide there. Our environmental team is now processing all of these back at our office, recovering all the cremated bone and carefully drying it. Once it's dry, it'll be labelled and rebagged, ready to be transferred back to our osteology lab in Oxford for quantification, assessment, and then later on analysis. Any complete urns or other vessels were block lifted on site, which then allows us to micro-excavate them in the lab under controlled conditions later on, and I'll talk about that in a little while. In some cases, it wasn't possible to block lift a vessel, usually because it was broken, like if it was high up in the ground, maybe been hit by a plough, or maybe it cracked because of soil pressure or something like that. In this case, we excavated it on site, which is much harder. It's not preferential to do because you don't have the controlled conditions of the lab. So we only did it when absolutely necessary. But you can see the images in the centre there, the one at the top with a little scale next to it, that's what the pot looked like when we first found it. And then once Joe had excavated it, you can see the central image at the bottom. Then the images that you can see on the very right are typically how we block lifting pots by wrapping them in cling film and cohesion bandages, making sure that everything was numbered and labelled, and then sticking them in boxes or sample tubs for safe transportation to the office and storage until they're ready to be excavated. So the kits I was talking about, they were very similar to the ones found in the 1960s excavations, which is not surprising. They tended to be square or rectangular and lined with local sandstone. There were varying numbers and types of vessels inside. I don't think that we had 2 that were the same. Some kists had 4 sides, some had less. We had a couple that were just 1 stone slab in the side. Some of them had lids, like you can see on the left there, other ones didn't. Some kists were constructed using reused roof tiles. We could tell this because you could see the nail hole in there, and sometimes these even had remnants of the nail still inside. Some of them just appeared to be stone slabs. It's unclear whether they were just stone slabs or maybe they were roof tiles and we just lost the nail hole. We're not sure. But we saved everything that looked like it was probably worked, so again we can have a worked stone specialist look at it later on. But most of the kists contained at least one vessel. Some of them did just contain an unearned cremation deposit though. So again, yeah, very variable. The cobble-lined pits were very interesting and quite unusual. I've certainly not seen anything quite like that before. We've got a good example of one on the slide there for you to have a look at. We had several of these where the edges of the pit were lined with cobbles, but then the space in the centre of the pit was distinctly square or rectangular, and hopefully you can see that on this image here. And some of these also had iron nails in the corners. So although no wood has survived in this case, we think that we're probably looking at some sort of wooden kist or pit lining. So basically a pit has been dug, boards have been put in, and then the space between the edge of the pit and the wooden boards has been packed with cobbles, and then the burial has taken place in the central chamber. You can see this is a really good example of this in here, which you can see has also got 2 Samian bowls and a greyware vessel in there as well. Traces of the wooden planks survived in a very limited number of cases, and you can see probably the best example here. So what you can see in the wider shot on the left is that we've got a large sub-rectangular pit. Now the majority of this space was actually just sterile soil. You can see that there's a metal fitting. It looks like maybe it's a boss or something, but again it needs cleaning up. We need a specialist to look at it. So some sort of large round iron fitting on the west side of the pit, and then we've got a grey wire jug in the east side of the pit, which has been propped up by a couple of cobbles. The rest of the soil in that part didn't have anything in it. It was completely sterile. However, at the very eastern end, you can see that we've got traces of a wooden plank adhering to several iron nails and brackets, and they divide that very eastern end of the pit from everything else. The traces of the wood is only really surviving around the iron, like where there's iron corrosion, and you can see that it's just like preserved some of the wood grain in it. And then that sectioned off eastern end was absolutely chock full of pyre debris. So it was a mixture of charcoal, cremated bone, burnt fines, mostly metal fines. There was a lot of copper alloy, a lot of iron nails in there. We think that this is basically the remains of stuff that was burnt on the pyre with the deceased. I actually excavated this feature. There were over 250 small finds recovered from this deposit, and we think it's probably pieces like metal cauldron and bucket and things like that, but again it all really needs looking at. What this shows is that for whatever reason the people who constructed this grave wanted to make a separate compartment to keep the pyre remains separate from everything else that was in there, and then the majority of the grave was full of grave goods. It'd be interesting to know if that large empty space was taken up by something organic, like maybe fabric or food or something made out of wool. It's anyone's guess really, but yeah, it's really interesting to see. Then we move on to the inhumation graves. So these weren't quite as common as the cremations, and most of them were in rectangular earth-cut graves. I should say we're assuming that they were once inhumations. So the unburnt bone preservation on the site was very poor, and we only recovered unburnt fragments of bone from 5 skeletons. So the 32 of the inhumation graves didn't have anything in them at all. Now, this is because the site is very sandy, and it means that it's very acidic geology, so the unburnt bone doesn't really survive in the way that the cremated bone does. So we're calling these features possible inhumations because they're kind of grave shapes and size. They're like sub-rectangular, they're about person-sized, and there's no indication that the feature was anything else. 12 of the inhumations were in stone-lined kists, like the one that you can see on the slide. They're very much like the stone-lined cremation kists, but they're just bigger so that you can fit an extended inhumation in them. Now, interestingly, the inhumations seem to be in little clusters dotted about on the site. This kind of gives us confidence that these were all inhumations rather than something else. Now, it's unclear at the moment whether these little pockets of inhumations were clusters of people from like the same family or maybe the same burial club, or they just happened to have a preference for inhumation and that was the inhumation area for that year or something like that. But again, these kind of spatial analysis are things that we can be looking into. Lastly, we had one feature that represented a pyre. So you can see on the slide there is a large rectangular pit that held the fire upon which at least one body had been burnt. The pit was filled with high quantities of charcoal and quite a lot of cremated remains. I should say that we don't actually think it's a bust and burial, we still just think it's a pyre rather than it being a bustum, which is a pit underneath a pyre where a whole person would burn down into it and then they just cover it up. We think that this is just a pyre where a person would be burnt on it and then it'd be left to cool down and then the ashes would be collected and disposed of elsewhere. So we excavated this feature very carefully in a grid, and the reason that we did this is so that we can monitor the spatial distribution of skeletal elements and other remains across the feature to see were people being burnt with their head was always at the same end of the pyre and things like that. We can also look at the fragments of cremated bone that are recovered from this feature and see what the minimum number of people represented are. So that might tell us whether the pyre was single use or whether it was reused multiple times for lots of different people. This is the only pyre that we found on our site, and there wasn't a pyre found on the 1960s excavation either. So I would say this one has probably been used multiple times. Either that or other pyre sites must be beyond where it's being excavated and we've just not found them yet. Again, this is something that we're going to consider when we get to analysing the cremated bone and also looking at the various different types of archaeological features on the site. I thought that I would spend a little bit of time just talking about some of the finds. Again, it's really difficult to quantify these at the moment because most of them haven't even been washed. So it is difficult to say exactly what we have, but I'm going to take you through a few of the highlights. We also very handily add our company Roman pottery specialists, Ed Bidoff and Kate Brady, were on hand on our Microsoft Teams chat so that when we did find nice whole vessels like the ones you can see on the slide, they were able to give us some information about them pretty rapidly, just through us sending a few photos and then being able to text back. What I can tell you is that generally speaking, we have a very diverse range of ceramic vessels. So we've got black burnished ware cooking pots. These are probably the most common type of vessel that we've got. They seem to be mostly being used as cremation urns. And we've got evidence that they were used for cooking first and then they were reused as a cremation urn. But as well as the black burnish ware pots, we've also got quite a lot of Samian ware, we've got grey ware, we've got Neem Valley ware, and we've got lots of other fabrics present as well. And in terms of the vessel types, so we've got the urns, we've got bowls, dishes, plates, jugs, cups, mortaria, that's just off the top of my head. So a very diverse range of vessel types. So many of these are present as whole grave goods. We have got some pottery that's obviously just residual and kind of kicking about in the backfills. We haven't really got around to looking at that yet, but a lot of the graves that you can see where vessels were present, they're like the ones that you can see on the slide. At the moment, it seems that most of the typologies we've got tend to date to the late 2nd or 3rd century, which fits with the findings from the 1960s excavation. But again, we'll be able to know more about that once our specialists have examined the pots in detail. We've also got a nice array of stamped Samian ware where we've got a maker's stamp visible on the vessel or a stamp in the actual mould in the decoration on the vessel. Once we get to look at these, we'll be able to identify who made the pots and whereabouts they were based. There's also a maker's stamp list from the 1960s excavation, so we can put that information together and see if we've got any of the same potters or if we've got different potters in this other part of the cemetery. Several vessels from the site also appear to have been ritually killed prior to burial. You can see that bottom left-hand vessel with the round hole in it. This has been made deliberately. A small hole has been hammered into the pot, but otherwise the vessel is intact. Now, this is actually a fairly common practice in the Roman period, particularly where pots are used as voting offerings or as grave goods. And again, some of these found in the 1960s excavation, so we're seeing the same sorts of practices used across the cemetery. We did have quite a lot of glass as well, both vessels and objects. Of course, much of the glass that we found was broken, so just lots of glass sherds like mixed in where there was once a vessel, but it's become crushed over time, and then it's broken up, unfortunately. But we did have some instances where that wasn't the case. You can see some on the slide. We did have some glass that was clearly heat affected, so you can see the second picture along the top. You've got kind of a glass globule. Where glass was heat affected, we're assuming that these pieces were glass objects that have been put on the pyre with the deceased, and then the melted remains have been collected up once they've been cooled and buried with the ashes. So the ones that aren't affected by heat are most likely to be grave goods, and you can see a few examples of those on the slide. We were lucky enough to find several very complete glass vessels, including that small cup that you can see on the top left and the bottle on the bottom right that once probably contained something like perfume or oil. Other types of glass objects that we found included lots and lots of different sorts of glass beads in all sorts of colours, shapes and styles. You can see we've got lots of blue glass beads, we've got some golden glass, we've got black ones, red ones, lots of different shapes as well. And again, the bead typology is going to be really interesting to look at, because there were an awful lot of these from the 1960s excavation, where beads from various locations in Europe were recovered, particularly from around the Trans-Danube region. So we'll be able to see if beads from those similar locations in Europe have been found on our excavation too. And like glass, the metalwork from the site came in many different forms. So we've got vessels, we've got nails, and then we've got a whole raft of different types of objects. Many of the Pyre debris deposits contained numerous fragments of burnt copper alloy or iron. Now, again, none of this has been analysed yet. Look, a lot of the copper alloy we think is probably from things like cauldrons or buckets that were being put on the pyre as pyre goods. And again, there was a lot of this found in the 1960s excavation. Where objects are unburned, then that's where they're likely to be grave goods. We got quite a lot of examples of personal items, so things like belt fittings, brooches, you can see a gold earring on the top there, bracelets, hobnails from shoes, and other small objects which we've not managed to identify yet. The presence of metal fittings on clothes and shoes, and also things like heat affected jewellery items, suggests that the deceased were probably dressed quite well when they were cremated, so they might have been dressed in the finest clothes. Probably the star of the show in terms of metalwork was this small Cupid figurine that you can see on the bottom left that was found with one of the cremation burials. So Cupid is a Roman god of love who is the son of Mercury and Venus, and a counterpart to the Greek god Eros. He's shown here naked and flying, and he's got a small bow and arrow. There's a small indentation on the back of the figure that suggests it might have been a decorative fitting for something, but we're not sure what yet. And there's just over 30 examples of similar Cupid figurines now from Rome and Britain, so in the scheme of things, it's pretty rare. Now, obviously, I don't have time to talk about every single find that I know of in detail, but other than those sort of main material types, I thought I'd just mention a few of the sort of standout examples that are very interesting. So the clay pipe figurine that you can see on the left has had quite a lot of attention in the media since it was on Digging for Britain, and rightly so. It was actually found in the same kist as that glass cup from a couple of slides ago. Now, these types of pipe clay figurines are usually found in funerary contexts, and most of the examples from the UK are in the form of Venus, like the one that was found in the 1960s that was on one of the slides at the very beginning of the talk. At the moment, we think that this figure is probably an infant holding a ball or maybe some sort of fruit. There's only 3 other examples of what we think to be the same design from the UK, but there are other examples from Central Europe. All the known UK examples are broken, so this is by far the most complete. And you can see as well around the edges that this one's been burned, so again, it's been on the pyre. Now, we didn't find any inscriptions, unfortunately, but on the west side of the site, we did find several fragments of broken tombstone, and we think that this may be because the tombstones were robbed out in the post-Roman period and perhaps reused somewhere else. There's an awful lot of free stone standing around in that field in the post-Roman period. So, and it's also notable that there's a fragment of Roman tombstone incorporated into the fabric of the castle across the road. We also found what we presume to be a stone column base that was just kind of hoofed into the top of one of the graves. So we don't know if that's part of a grave monument and they just decided they didn't want that bit, or where it was from. And later disturbance of graves was also apparent elsewhere on site too. For example, we had a large pit in the southwest corner of the site that may once have been a grave. It was very heavily rooted as well though, and it didn't have anything in it except for one tombstone fragment and that really large amber bead that you can see on the top right of the image, and they were right in the bottom of the pit. So again, it's not exactly clear what's going on there. Is that a robbed out grave? Is it something else? We're not sure, but that bead has ended up in the bottom of it somehow. And then lastly, we found hundreds and hundreds of fragments of burnt worked animal bone. You can see those two images in the bottom centre of the slide. Now, lots of these were found during the 1960s excavation as well. They tend to feature incised lines, geometric shapes, and then circles or spirals. They tend to be flat and thin, and some have what look like small pegs carved into the reverse side. It's presumed that these are decorative veneers, maybe for small decorative boxes that were placed on the pyre. Or alternatively, it's been suggested that they were decorative inlay for large funeral biers that were used to carry the deceased to the pyre, but then were also placed on the pyre. And there's a really, really nice reconstruction of one of these from Tully House Museum, which you can see on the slide here. We're going to be looking at all these in much more detail, and hopefully we'll be able to figure out if it is likely that these veneers were from something like this bier. Just to sort of round up, I thought I'd talk a little bit about excavating the vessels. We did excavate a couple of test urns in late 2025 just to get a handle on what we might expect to be inside these things and how long it might take to excavate each one. But the main programme of vessel excavation began in January 2026. So as you can imagine, we've only just started and we've got quite a long way to go. There were about 130 vessels block lifted for micro excavation, and there's only 2 of us excavating them, so it may take a little while. Each vessel is carefully excavated in 2 centimetre layers, allowing the osteologist to record any identifiable bone fragments, charcoal, and other finds using photographs and also paper records and notes. The cremated bone deposits recovered from the urns so far appear to be both male and female adults and also children. So this suggests the cemetery wasn't just for the soldiers from the fortress, it was also used by the civilians from the nearby vicus. One urn was also scanned using computer tomography, a CT scan, and this imaging allows us to see the contents of the urn prior to excavation. To summarise, there's only very general points that we can make at the moment until we begin detailed analysis. However, we can say that the site has much earlier origins as the funerary space, with the 2nd to 3rd century Roman cemetery appearing to be focused around the remains of a Bronze Age funerary site. Preliminary osteological data corroborates osteological analysis of the cremation deposits excavated in the 1960s, suggesting that the cemetery was used both by soldiers from the fortress and civilians from the vicus. And while there were some items found more commonly in graves, such as the black burnished urns, the range of items placed on the pyre and buried in the grave was very diverse. This likely reflects the diversity of the population, or at least the degree of personal choice available when deciding what to include in the grave of a loved one. Both inhumation and cremation were practiced during the lifespan of the cemetery, which again suggests an element of choice in funerary practice. And finally, what's going to happen in the future? Formal assessment of the assemblage will only begin after fieldwork's complete and after the finds are washed and all the samples are processed. Initial assessment of the assemblage will quantify the cremated bone, the various types of finds, and determine potential for further scientific analysis. Then full analysis will begin again once the post-excavation programme has been scoped out and approved, and eventually all the assemblages will be published and then deposited at the local museum. Thank you very much for listening to my talk.